Sometimes the people who love you most are the first to crush your dreams. When your own family calls you a fool, it cuts deeper than any stranger's words ever could. Luke Rayner felt that pain when he inherited his father's burned cabin in Montana. Everyone told him to walk away from the charred mess. His brother laughed. His sister shook her head. Even his mother said he was wasting his time. But Luke saw something they couldn't see in those blackened walls and broken windows. He moved in with nothing but his tools and started rebuilding, board by board. As he pulled up the damaged kitchen floor, his crowbar struck something hard underneath. Hidden beneath years of ash and debris was a secret that would change everything. What was his father hiding all those years? And why did this simple war veteran leave behind something worth more than anyone imagined? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Luke Rayner had never been the successful one. At 43, his hands bore the calluses of honest work, but his bank account told a different story. While his brother Tom built a thriving insurance business in Billings and his sister Sarah climbed the corporate ladder in Seattle, Luke scraped by with odd jobs and repair work in small Montana towns. His truck was 15 years old, his apartment was a converted garage, and his biggest client paid him in cash because his credit was shot. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd inherited the one thing nobody else wanted. Frank Rayner's cabin sat 40 miles north of Helena, accessible only by a winding dirt road that turned to mud every spring and disappeared under snow every winter. The old man had lived there for 27 years, ever since Luke's mother Helen had finally given up trying to save their marriage. Frank chose isolation over family dinners, silence over explanations, and a bottle over everything else that mattered. Luke pulled his battered Ford up to what remained of the structure on a grey October morning. The fire had happened 3 months ago. A neighbor had spotted the smoke from 5 miles away, but by the time the volunteer fire department arrived, there wasn't much left to save. The insurance investigator had ruled it an electrical fault, probably caused by Frank's habit of jury-rigging repairs with whatever materials he had lying around. Standing before the ruins now, Luke could see why his family thought he was crazy. The roof had collapsed entirely on the north side, leaving charred beams pointing skyward like broken ribs. Windows had blown out from the heat, their frames twisted into abstract sculptures of melted vinyl. The porch, where Frank used to sit with his morning coffee, had become a pile of ash-covered lumber. Even the stone chimney, which should have survived anything, had cracked down the middle. But Luke saw bones where others saw death. The foundation was solid. Frank had built it himself using river rock and mortar, mixed strong enough to last generations. The south wall had survived mostly intact, its log construction proving the old man knew something about building to last. Most importantly, the well still produced clean water, and the septic system Frank had installed just 5 years ago remained undamaged. "You could build something nice here," Luke murmured to himself, running his palm along the surviving wall. "Something that would make you proud, Dad." His relationship with Frank had been complicated, to put it kindly. Luke remembered a different man from his early childhood, someone who taught him to use tools, who showed him how to read the grain in wood, who explained that measuring twice and cutting once wasn't just about carpentry. But that Frank had disappeared gradually, replaced by someone distant and bitter. By the time Luke graduated high school, conversations between father and son rarely extended beyond grunts and nods. The drinking had gotten worse after the divorce. Frank would show up to Luke's baseball games smelling like whiskey, or miss them entirely. He'd promised to teach Luke to drive stick shift, then forget about it for months. When Luke started his own handyman business at 25, Frank had offered exactly one piece of advice: don't expect it to make you rich. Still, Luke had kept visiting. Every few months, he'd drive out to the cabin with groceries or supplies, hoping for something resembling a normal conversation. Frank would accept the help without thanks, offer Luke a beer, and they'd sit on the porch in silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Luke had always assumed there would be time to fix things between them eventually. The heart attack had taken that possibility away on a Tuesday morning in March. Frank was found 3 days later by the mail carrier, slumped over his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. The funeral had been small, just immediate family and a few neighbors who barely knew him. Luke had been surprised by how many people showed up, and even more surprised by how many of them mentioned Frank's kindness when Luke wasn't looking. "He fixed my tractor once," an elderly farmer had told Luke after the service. "Wouldn't take a penny for it, said he was just helping a neighbor. Your dad used to leave firewood on my porch every winter," another neighbor had added. "Never said a word about it, but I knew it was him." These glimpses of Frank's hidden generosity had haunted Luke for months. They suggested a man entirely different from the bitter recluse Luke thought he knew. Maybe that's why, when Tom and Sarah immediately started pressuring him to sell the property, Luke had felt compelled to refuse. "It's worthless, Luke," Sarah had argued during their last family meeting. "The land's too remote for development, too small for ranching, and now there's no house. Cut your losses and walk away." Tom had been more direct. "You think you can fix this? Look around, brother. Even Dad couldn't make a go of it out here. What makes you think you can do better?" Their mother had tried to be supportive, but Luke could see the worry in her eyes. "Honey, you don't have the money for a project like this. Maybe it's time to be practical." But Luke had already made his decision. He'd taken the small inheritance left by his grandfather, money he'd been saving for emergencies, and put it toward basic supplies. His plan was simple: move into the cabin's shell, live rough while he rebuilt it, and create something worthy of the man his father might have been underneath all that pain. The day he'd announced his intention to move out here, the family reactions had been swift and predictable. Tom had called him an idiot. Sarah had accused him of wasting everyone's time with his romantic notions. Even Helen had suggested he was having some kind of breakdown. "This isn't about proving anything to Dad," Luke had insisted, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "It's about not letting something with good bones go to waste." Now, standing in the ruins with his toolbox and a thermos of coffee, Luke began the methodical work of assessment. He'd brought his father's old toolbox, the one Frank had carried through 40 years of construction jobs before the drinking made steady work impossible. The tools were worn but well-maintained, each one bearing the patina of countless projects. Holding his father's hammer, Luke could almost feel the echo of all the work it had accomplished. The kitchen had been the heart of the fire, which made sense given Frank's casual attitude toward electrical safety. Luke carefully picked through the debris, looking for anything salvageable. Most of the appliances were twisted metal, and the cabinets had been reduced to charcoal. But as he worked, something caught his eye. In the corner where the old stove had stood, the floorboards looked different. While everything around them was burned black, these particular boards showed scorch marks in an odd pattern, almost as if something beneath them had protected them from the worst of the heat. Luke knelt down and ran his fingers along the wood grain. These weren't the same pine boards used in the rest of the cabin. These were oak, much harder to burn, and they'd been cut to fit this specific space. Curious, Luke fetched his crowbar from the toolbox. The first board came up easily, revealing what looked like a purposefully built compartment. His heart began to race as he pried up the second board, then the third. There, nestled in a space that had been carefully carved out of the floor joists, sat a metal fireproof box. Luke's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out. The box was heavy, about the size of a briefcase, with a simple combination lock that looked like it had been installed recently. The metal showed no signs of fire damage. Frank had chosen its hiding place well. Luke carried the box outside and set it on the tailgate of his truck. 3 months of wondering about his father's secrets, and here was something concrete, something hidden, something important enough that Frank had built a special compartment to protect it. The combination lock had 4 digits. Luke tried Frank's birth year first, then his own, then Helen's. Nothing. He tried Frank's military service number. Luke had memorized it from hearing his father recite it to VA representatives over the years. The lock clicked open on the third digit. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were items that made no immediate sense. Photographs of Frank in military uniform, but not from his official service during Korea. These showed him with a small group of men in what looked like civilian clothes, standing in front of mining equipment. The terrain looked like Montana, but Luke didn't recognize the location. Beneath the photographs were medals Luke had never seen before, commendations that didn't match his father's official military record. There were handwritten notes in Frank's careful script, mostly cryptic references to places and coordinates. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate cloth, was a leather journal bound with string. Luke opened the journal carefully. The first entry was dated 1952, just after Frank's return from Korea. But instead of war stories, the pages contained detailed maps, geological surveys, and what appeared to be mining claims documentation. The handwriting was methodical, almost obsessive in its precision. As Luke read, a picture began to emerge that challenged everything he thought he knew about his father. These weren't the writings of a broken-down veteran drowning his sorrows. These were the careful records of someone engaged in important, secretive work. The sun was setting by the time Luke closed the journal. He'd only read the first dozen pages, but already his understanding of Frank Rayner was shifting. The man who'd seemed to waste his life in isolation had actually been protecting something. The question was, what and why? He'd felt the need to hide it, even from his own son. Luke packed the box's contents carefully and locked it in his truck. Tomorrow he'd start asking questions. Tonight he'd make his first camp in the cabin ruins, sleeping in his tent next to the foundation where his father had lived and died with his secrets. As he rolled out his sleeping bag on the only intact section of flooring, Luke realized something had changed. For the first time in his adult life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His family might think he was a fool, but his father had left him a mystery that was worth solving. The charred cabin suddenly felt less like a burden and more like an inheritance of a different kind entirely. The hidden metal box had kept Luke awake most of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those photographs of his father with unknown men, the mysterious medals, the careful handwriting that spoke of secrets maintained for decades. By dawn, he was already brewing coffee over his camp stove, the journal spread open beside him on a makeshift table built from sawhorses and plywood. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in yesterday's fading sun. The photographs weren't just casual snapshots, they had the formal composition of official documentation. Each image showed the same group of 5 men in what appeared to be mining gear, but their posture and bearing suggested military training. His father looked younger, maybe 30, with the lean build of someone accustomed to physical labor and the alert eyes of someone always watching for danger. Luke studied each face carefully. These weren't the kind of men Frank would have met in his official army service. Korea had been infantry work, muddy trenches and desperate firefights, not the organized exploration these photos suggested. Yet the dates on the back of the pictures placed them during Frank's supposed service years. The journal provided more questions than answers. Frank's entries were written in a kind of shorthand that mixed military terminology with geological references. Coordinates appeared frequently, always followed by cryptic abbreviations that Luke couldn't decode, but one location kept recurring: White Rock Creek. Luke had lived in Montana his entire life, and he'd never heard of White Rock Creek. He opened his phone's mapping application, but the weak cellular signal this far from town made internet searches impossible. He'd need to drive back towards civilization to research properly. As he packed up his camp, Luke noticed something he'd missed in yesterday's exploration. The corner where he'd found the box wasn't the only place where the floorboards looked different. There were at least 3 other sections where the wood grain didn't match the surrounding boards. Frank hadn't just hidden one thing, he'd built multiple concealment points throughout the cabin. The realization made Luke's hands shake as he loaded his crowbar. His father hadn't been paranoid or eccentric. He'd been methodical, professional, the kind of careful that came from understanding real consequences. Luke chose the section near what had been Frank's bedroom. The boards here had survived better than those in the kitchen, and they pried up with less effort. Underneath, he found another compartment, this one containing items that made even less sense than the first discovery. A canvas bag held what appeared to be ore samples, chunks of quartz shot through with gold veins. Not the kind of samples a casual prospector might collect, but professionally extracted specimens with numbered tags and documentation. Each sample was labeled with coordinates and dates, the handwriting matching Frank's journal entries. More disturbing were the newspaper clippings, yellowed with age but carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Headlines from the early 1950s told stories Luke had never heard. Military gold recovery operation suspended. Korean War treasures remain missing. Army investigation concludes with classified report. The clippings suggested a story that had been buried, along with whatever Frank and his team had been looking for. But buried by whom and why? Luke's phone buzzed with a rare text message that had managed to push through the weak signal. Tom. Mom's worried. Call when you get this. The mundane intrusion of family concern felt strange against the backdrop of what he was discovering. How could he explain that their father, the man they'd dismissed as a broken-down drunk, had been keeping military secrets for half a century? He drove toward Helena, the box and its contents secured in his truck's lockbox. The closer he got to town, the more the real world pressed in around him. Traffic lights, shopping centers, people going about their normal lives, all of it felt foreign after just 2 days in the ruins of Frank's hidden life. The Helena Public Library's local history section was small but well organized. Luke started with mining records, searching for any reference to White Rock Creek. After 2 hours of dusty volumes and microfilm, he found it, a small notation in a 1,887 territorial survey that mentioned White Rock Creek mining claim 247, abandoned following cave-in incident. The claim had been registered to a consortium of investors from back east, men with surnames that suggested German or Austrian origins. According to the records, the claim had produced significant quantities of gold before the cave-in killed 3 workers and forced abandonment. No subsequent claims had ever been filed for the same area. Luke traced the location on modern topographical maps. White Rock Creek was approximately 15 miles northwest of Frank's cabin, in an area that was now part of the Helena National Forest. The old mining road had long since been reclaimed by wilderness, but the creek itself was marked on current maps. With growing excitement, Luke realized that Frank's property sat almost directly between Helena and the abandoned mine. It would have been the perfect base of operations for anyone looking to explore or recover whatever the original miners had left behind. But the newspaper clippings suggested this hadn't been a civilian treasure hunt. The references to military gold recovery operations and Korean War treasures implied something much larger and more dangerous. Luke spent another hour researching the headlines, but most of the stories were frustratingly vague, full of official denials and classified information notices. It was nearly evening when Luke found the reference that changed everything. Buried in a 1953 Army newsletter was a small item about Operation Shepherd, described as a successful recovery mission conducted by specialized personnel in various domestic locations. The item mentioned that several team members had been commended for their discretion and professionalism in handling sensitive materials. Luke's pulse quickened as he cross-referenced the date with his father's journal. Frank's entries from late 1952 and early 1953 contained repeated references to someone called Shepherd, always capitalized, always mentioned with what seemed like cautious respect. The picture that emerged was of a covert military operation conducted on American soil, designed to recover valuable materials that had somehow ended up in the wrong hands. Frank had been part of a small team tasked with finding and securing these materials, using the cover story of mineral exploration. But something had gone wrong. Frank's journal entries from 1954 onward took on a different tone, less confident, more worried. References to Shepard became less frequent, then disappeared entirely. The careful geological surveys gave way to what looked like security precautions, methods for concealing evidence, procedures for maintaining cover identities, contingency plans for if something happens to me. Luke drove back to the cabin as darkness fell, his mind racing with implications. Frank hadn't been hiding from his family's disappointment or drowning his failures in alcohol. He'd been protecting something, or protecting himself from someone who wanted that something back. The ruins looked different now, no longer the remains of a failed life, but the carefully chosen fortress of a man who knew he was in danger. Frank had picked this location for its isolation, its defensive positions, its proximity to whatever he and his team had found at White Rock Creek. Luke parked his truck in the same spot Frank had used for 27 years and sat in the darkness, trying to process everything he'd learned. His father had been a soldier long after his official service ended, carrying out a mission that had required him to sacrifice his family relationships to maintain his cover. The drinking, the isolation, the bitter refusal to explain himself, all of it made sense if Frank had been protecting a secret valuable enough to kill for. And if Luke's research was accurate, people had indeed been killed to keep this secret buried. As he climbed out of his truck and gathered his camping gear, Luke realized he was no longer alone in this mystery. Somewhere out there, other people knew what Frank had been hiding. They'd known for 60 years, and they'd been patient. But now Frank was dead, and his son was asking questions that might threaten their carefully maintained silence. Luke made his camp with new awareness of the darkness beyond his small circle of light. Every sound from the forest made him pause. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threat. For the first time, he understood why Frank had chosen such complete isolation. Tomorrow, he'd begin the search for White Rock Creek and whatever Frank's team had found there. But tonight, as he lay in his sleeping bag, surrounded by the ruins of his father's secret life, Luke finally grasped the true inheritance Frank had left him. It wasn't just a burned cabin that needed rebuilding. It was a mystery that had cost his father everything, and might very well cost Luke the same price. Luke spent 3 more days excavating the cabin's hidden compartments before he found Frank's war journal. Unlike the sparse entries in the first journal, this leather-bound book contained detailed accounts of missions that bore no resemblance to Frank's official military service record. The journal revealed a side of his father that Luke had never imagined. Frank wrote with the precision of someone documenting evidence, each entry carefully dated and witnessed with initials that Luke assumed belonged to his team members. The handwriting was steady, confident, nothing like the shaky scrawl Luke remembered from Frank's later years when the alcohol had taken its toll. The first entries dealt with what Frank called recovery operations in various locations across the American West. The team had been tasked with tracking down Nazi gold that had been smuggled into the United States during the final months of World War II. According to Frank's records, high-ranking German officers had used a network of sympathizers to move substantial quantities of stolen treasure out of Europe as the Third Reich collapsed. Luke read with growing fascination as Frank described a systematic hunt that had taken the team from Colorado mining towns to Nevada ghost towns, following paper trails and whispered rumors. They weren't the only ones searching. Frank's journal mentioned competitors who seemed willing to use violence to claim the treasure for themselves. The operation had been classified at the highest levels. Frank's team reported directly to someone, identified only as Shepard, who provided intelligence and resources while maintaining complete secrecy about the mission's true scope. The official story, if anyone asked, was that they were conducting geological surveys for the Army Corps of Engineers. By 1952, the team had narrowed their search to Montana, specifically to mining claims that had been purchased by German nationals in the 1940s. Frank's journal entries from this period showed increasing excitement as they closed in on their target. References to the mother lode and enough to change everything suggested they were pursuing something far more valuable than Luke had imagined. The breakthrough had come at White Rock Creek. Frank's journal entry for November 15, 1952, was longer and more detailed than any previous entry. Found the main cache today. BC and RJ estimate 200 M plus in gold bars and coins, all marked with German eagles and swastikas. Shepard's intelligence was correct. The Heinrich group moved everything here in 1945, using the old mine shaft as natural storage. Cave-in that killed the original miners wasn't an accident. The Germans collapsed the entrance deliberately after hiding their treasure. Team consensus is to proceed with recovery, but Shepard's orders are to wait. Says we need better security before moving that kind of weight. RJ getting nervous about exposure. BC worried about other teams moving in on our find. I trust Shepard, but time isn't on our side. Luke had to stop reading to process the implications. His father and his team had found a Nazi treasure worth $200 million in $1,952, easily 10 times that amount in current value. They'd found it, but they hadn't recovered it. Subsequent entries revealed why. Frank's handwriting became increasingly tense as he described surveillance by unknown parties, equipment sabotage, and what appeared to be deliberate attempts to delay or disrupt their operation. Someone else knew about the treasure, and they were willing to fight for it. The situation had deteriorated rapidly in early 1953. Frank's journal entries became shorter, more paranoid. Team members began reporting strange encounters, men asking questions in local towns, vehicles following them at a distance, break-ins at their temporary camps. Shepard had ordered them to suspend operations and maintain surveillance only, but it was clear that their security had been compromised. The final entries were the most disturbing. Frank wrote about his teammates with growing concern. BC found dead in his motel room. Official causes heart attack, but he was 29 years old and healthy as a horse. RJ's truck went off the road near Great Falls, brake failure, they said, but RJ was the best mechanic I ever knew. He wouldn't drive a vehicle with bad brakes. Starting to think Shepard's security concerns were more serious than he let on. Luke's hands trembled as he read the last entry in Frank's war journal. Shepard met with me today. Says the operation is terminated permanently. Orders are to forget everything, resume normal lives, never speak of what we found. But I know better. They're cleaning house, eliminating everyone who knows about White Rock Creek. Shepard isn't protecting us, he's protecting the secret, and that means I'm next. Taking defensive measures. If anything happens to me, Helen and the boy will be safe as long as they don't know anything. Sometimes the greatest love is distance. Sometimes protection looks like abandonment. If someone finds this journal, know that Frank Rayner died protecting his family from a secret that was worth killing for. The treasure is still there. The coordinates are in the mining surveys, but don't trust anyone, especially don't trust Shepard. Luke closed the journal and sat in stunned silence. Everything made sense now. Frank's sudden personality change after returning from Korea, his withdrawal from family life, his descent into alcoholism. He hadn't been running away from responsibility. He'd been creating distance to protect the people he loved most. The drinking, the isolation, the bitter refusal to explain himself, all of it had been an elaborate deception designed to make Frank Rayner appear worthless to anyone who might see him as a threat. He'd sacrificed his relationships, his reputation, and his happiness to keep Luke and Helen safe from whoever had killed his teammates. Luke spent the rest of the day processing this revelation while continuing his systematic search of the cabin. In a compartment beneath what had been Frank's bedroom, he found additional evidence that confirmed his father's story. Military commendations that had never been officially recorded. Photographs of gold bars bearing Nazi eagle stamps, geological surveys that pinpointed the exact location of the White Rock Creek cache. Most importantly, he found correspondence between Frank and his surviving teammates. Letters written in a simple code revealed that the three men had maintained contact for years after the official termination of their mission. They'd shared intelligence about suspicious deaths among other treasure hunters, tracked the movements of people who might be connected to their old handler, Shepard, and maintained elaborate security protocols to protect themselves and their families. But the letters also revealed that Frank's teammates had died exactly as he'd predicted. Robert Chen had died in a suspicious car accident in 1987. James Mitchell had succumbed to an apparent heart attack while hiking alone in 1994. In each case, Frank had noted details that suggested the deaths weren't natural or accidental. By sunset, Luke understood that he was now the only living person who knew the complete story of what his father's team had found at White Rock Creek. The treasure was still there, hidden in an abandoned mine shaft, worth hundreds of millions in current dollars. But it was also protected by someone who had spent 60 years killing to keep it secret. Luke made his evening camp with new precautions, positioning his tent where it couldn't be seen from the road, and keeping his truck ready for a quick departure. Frank's journal had taught him that paranoia wasn't mental illness, it was survival instinct, for people who knew too much about things that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. As he reviewed the coordinates Frank had so carefully preserved, Luke realized he faced an impossible choice. He could forget everything he'd learned, rebuild the cabin, and live the simple life his family expected. Or he could pursue the truth his father had died protecting, knowing that the same people who'd killed Frank's teammates would almost certainly kill him too. But there was a third option that Frank hadn't considered. Luke wasn't a frightened veteran trying to protect his family through isolation and deception. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a lifetime of anger at being dismissed as a failure. If someone had stolen 60 years of his father's life, Luke was going to make them pay for it. The treasure at White Rock Creek wasn't just about money. It was about justice for Frank Raynor and vindication for every choice that had made him look weak when he was actually being strong. Luke was going to find that treasure, expose the people who'd killed for it, and prove once and for all that the Raynor family deserved more respect than they'd ever received. Tomorrow, he'd begin the dangerous journey to White Rock Creek. Tonight, he'd prepare for war. The hidden compartment beneath Frank's workshop held the most startling discovery yet. Luke had almost missed it. The section of flooring looked identical to the rest, but his systematic probing with a metal detector had revealed the hollow space underneath. When he finally pried up the boards, he found a waterproof container holding documents that changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. The original survey maps were hand-drawn on heavy paper that had somehow survived decades of Montana weather. Unlike modern topographical surveys, these maps showed the land as it existed in the 1880s, complete with mining claims, territorial boundaries, and geographic features that no longer appeared on current maps. Luke spread them carefully across his makeshift work table, weighting the corners with stones to keep them flat in the morning breeze. What he saw made his breath catch. Frank's property wasn't just coincidentally located near the White Rock Creek mine. According to these territorial surveys, Frank's 40 acres sat directly on top of the original White Rock mining claim, 247, registered to Heinrich Goldberg and Associates in 1887. Luke traced the claim boundaries with his finger. The maps showed that Goldberg's consortium had owned nearly 2,000 acres, encompassing not just the mine site, but also the network of access roads, support buildings, and worker housing that would have been necessary for a major mining operation. Frank's cabin sat exactly where the original mine superintendent's residence had been built. More intriguing were the geological notations scattered across the maps. Previous surveyors had marked potential ore deposits, water sources, and natural cave systems throughout the claim area. Luke realized that Frank's team wouldn't have needed to search randomly for the Nazi treasure. They would have had detailed maps showing every hiding place the Germans could have used. But the maps raised disturbing questions about the 1,887 cave-in that had supposedly ended mining operations. According to Frank's journal, the Germans had deliberately collapsed the mine entrance in 1945 to hide their treasure. Yet the original mining records showed that workers had died in a cave-in nearly 60 years earlier. How could both stories be true? Luke found the answer in a folder of documents that had been preserved with the same meticulous care Frank applied to everything else. Death certificates from 1,887 showed that 3 men had indeed died in a mining accident, but not from a cave-in. They'd been crushed when a support timber failed during excavation of a new tunnel. The mine itself had remained operational for another 2 years before being abandoned due to declining ore quality. The discrepancy suggested that someone had deliberately spread false information about the mine's condition, probably to discourage other treasure hunters from investigating the site. But it also meant that the mine was more accessible than Frank's journal had indicated. If the Germans had been able to hide treasure there in 1945, Luke should be able to reach it with the right equipment. He spent the morning studying every detail of the maps and documents, making careful notes about elevation changes, water sources, and possible access routes. The original mine had been served by a network of roads that followed natural ridgelines and creek beds, routes that would still exist even if they were overgrown with 60 years of forest growth. Luke's planning was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. He quickly gathered the maps and documents, stuffing them into a canvas bag as his brother Tom's familiar pickup truck came up the dirt road. Luke hadn't spoken to any family members since announcing his decision to rebuild the cabin, and Tom's unannounced visit couldn't be coincidental. "Mum sent me to check on you," Tom said without preamble as he climbed out of his truck. "She thinks you're having some kind of breakdown out here." Luke forced himself to appear casual, while his heart raced with the knowledge that Nazi treasure maps were sitting just feet from his brother's position. "I'm fine, Tom. Just working on the cabin." Tom looked around at the ruins with the same dismissive expression he'd worn at their last family meeting. "Working on what?" "Luke, there's nothing here worth saving. You're living in a tent next to a pile of burned wood, spending money you don't have on a project that makes no sense." "It makes sense to me." "Why?" Tom's voice carried the frustrated tone of someone who'd been having this argument for months. "What is it about this place that's got you so obsessed? Dad lived here for 30 years and accomplished exactly nothing. He drank himself to death in the middle of nowhere, and now you want to follow in his footsteps?" Luke felt the familiar anger rising at his brother's casual dismissal of Frank's life. But now, armed with knowledge of what their father had actually been doing all those years, the anger carried a different quality. Tom wasn't just being insensitive, he was insulting a man who'd sacrificed everything to protect his family. "Maybe Dad had reasons for living the way he did," Luke said carefully. "Maybe there were things about his life that we didn't understand." Tom laughed bitterly. "Come on, Luke. What reasons? He was a drunk who chose a bottle over his family. There's nothing complicated about that story." Luke wanted desperately to tell his brother the truth, to show him Frank's journal, to explain about the Nazi treasure and the murdered teammates, to make Tom understand that their father had been a hero instead of a failure. But Frank's final journal entry echoed in his mind. The greatest protection was ignorance. As long as Tom and the rest of the family knew nothing about Frank's secrets, they were safe from whoever had been killing to protect those secrets. "I just think he deserves better than being remembered as a failure," Luke said instead. "He deserves to be remembered honestly. And honestly, Luke, you're starting to sound like him." All this mystical talk about what Dad deserved and what this place means, that's exactly the kind of thinking that kept him out here drinking alone while his family moved on with their lives. Tom walked closer to the cabin ruins, kicking at pieces of charred wood. You know what I think? I think you're using Dad's memory as an excuse to avoid dealing with your own problems. Your business is failing. You're broke. You haven't had a serious relationship in years. Instead of fixing your actual life, you're out here playing pretend with this fantasy about rebuilding Dad's cabin. Luke felt his composure slipping. Every word Tom spoke was technically accurate, but it was also completely wrong. Luke wasn't avoiding his problems, he was confronting the biggest problem his family had ever faced. He was trying to solve a mystery that had defined their lives for decades, even though they'd never known it existed. Maybe my business is failing because I never had the advantages you and Sarah got, Luke said. Maybe some of us don't get handed success on a silver platter. Advantages? Tom's voice rose. What advantages? We all had the same parents, Luke. We all dealt with Dad's drinking and the divorce and everything else. The difference is that Sarah and I decided to move forward instead of wallowing in it. You moved forward because you could afford to. Because you didn't spend your 20s taking care of Mom while Dad was out here. Because you didn't have to watch him drink himself to death while knowing there was nothing you could do about it. Tom was quiet for a long moment, and Luke thought maybe he'd finally gotten through to him. But when his brother spoke again, his voice was harder than before. You're right about one thing, Luke. You couldn't do anything about Dad's drinking. And you can't do anything about this place either. You can't fix the past by rebuilding a burned cabin. You can't make Dad's life meaningful by convincing yourself it was some kind of noble sacrifice. Sometimes people just fail, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. With that, Tom climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Luke standing alone among the ruins with a canvas bag full of evidence that would have changed everything Tom believed about their father. Luke waited until the sound of Tom's truck disappeared completely before retrieving the maps and documents. His brother's visit had been a painful reminder of how completely Frank's deception had succeeded. Even his own family believed the cover story so thoroughly that they'd rather think Luke was having a breakdown than consider the possibility that Frank Raynor might have been protecting something valuable. But Tom's skepticism had also revealed something useful. If Luke's own brother couldn't imagine Frank having secrets worth protecting, then Frank's enemies probably felt the same way. They'd killed Frank's teammates and spent decades watching for any sign that someone might resume the search for the White Rock Creek treasure. But they weren't watching Frank's family, because Frank's family had been so thoroughly convinced of his worthlessness that they posed no apparent threat. Luke spread the maps out again, studying the route to White Rock Creek with new determination. Tom was wrong about almost everything, but he'd been right about one thing. Luke couldn't change the past. He couldn't give his father back the family relationships that Frank had sacrificed to keep them safe. But he could finish what Frank had started. He could find the treasure, expose the people who'd stolen 60 years of Frank's life, and prove to the world that Frank Raynor had been worth more than anyone had ever imagined. The coordinates were clear on the territorial survey maps. The route was challenging, but not impossible. And for the first time in his adult life, Luke had something worth fighting for that was bigger than his own problems. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey to White Rock Creek. The coded letters were hidden in a place Luke almost missed, sewn into the lining of Frank's old army duffel bag. Luke had been about to donate the bag to charity when he noticed that one corner felt unusually stiff. Careful examination revealed a hidden pocket containing nearly 40 letters spanning 3 decades, all written in what appeared to be random chit-chat between old army buddies. But Luke had learned enough about his father's methods to know that nothing Frank preserved was ever random. He spread the letters across his work table in chronological order and began looking for patterns. The breakthrough came when he realized that certain words appeared with unusual frequency across multiple letters, words like fishing, weather, and equipment that seemed innocuous individually but might carry deeper meaning when analyzed systematically. Luke had never been good at puzzles, but 43 years of construction work had taught him patience and methodical problem-solving. He created a simple grid system, noting every recurring phrase and its context. After several hours of work, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. The letters weren't just coded, they were tracking a systematic campaign of murder that had lasted for decades. The earliest letters, dated 1954, came from Robert Chen and James Mitchell, Frank's surviving teammates. Written in the casual tone of veterans staying in touch, they actually documented the suspicious deaths of other treasure hunters who'd gotten too close to the White Rock Creek secret. A fishing trip meant someone was asking questions about the mine. Bad weather indicated that the person had been warned off or scared away. Equipment failure meant they'd been killed. By 1960, the letters revealed that at least 12 people had died under suspicious circumstances while searching for Nazi treasure in Montana. Some were independent prospectors following old rumors. Others were former military personnel who'd heard whispers about Operation Shepherd. All of them had suffered convenient accidents right around the time they'd started getting close to the truth. Frank and his teammates had been documenting these deaths, comparing details, and slowly realizing that their former handler, the mysterious Shepherd, was still actively protecting the secret they'd uncovered. But the letters also revealed something more disturbing. Shepherd wasn't working alone. References to the organization and management decisions suggested that the White Rock Creek treasure was being protected by a group with substantial resources and long-term planning capabilities. The letters from the 1970s showed increasing paranoia as Frank's teammates realized they were being watched. Robert Chen wrote about sales calls from insurance agents who asked too many questions about his health and family. James Mitchell mentioned job opportunities that seemed designed to relocate him to more isolated areas where accidents might be easier to arrange. Frank's responses, written in the same careful code, revealed his strategy for staying alive. He'd cultivated his reputation as a worthless drunk, specifically to make himself appear unthreatening. The more pathetic Frank Rayner seemed to outside observers, the less likely he was to be seen as someone capable of finding and exploiting a multi-million-dollar treasure. But the strategy had only worked for so long. The letters from the 1980s documented the systematic elimination of Frank's teammates, despite their precautions. Robert Chen's death in 1987 had officially been ruled a heart attack, but his final letter to Frank contained details that suggested otherwise. Chen had been visited by old army friends, asking about his service record just weeks before his death. He'd been in perfect health and had no family history of heart disease. James Mitchell's death in 1994 had been even more suspicious. The letter preceding his death mentioned that Mitchell had been contacted by a researcher writing a book about forgotten military operations in the Korean War era. The researcher had asked specifically about geological survey work and any unusual discoveries Mitchell might have made during his service. Mitchell had been found dead on a hiking trail 3 days after agreeing to an interview. The final letters in the sequence, dated just months before Frank's own death, revealed that the elderly veteran had known his time was running out. But instead of despair, Frank's coded messages showed grim satisfaction. He'd spent decades preparing for this moment, carefully documenting everything he knew and hiding the evidence where it would eventually be found by someone he trusted. Luke realized that Frank's entire life strategy had been built around this moment, the day when his son would find the hidden letters and understand what really happened to Frank Rayner and his teammates. Every choice Frank had made, every sacrifice he'd endured, had been designed to keep the secret safe until Luke was ready to inherit it. But the letters also contained a warning that made Luke's hands shake as he decoded it. Frank's final message to his dead teammates revealed that Shepherd now in his 90s but still dangerous, had recently made contact with surviving family members of the operation's participants. The old man was tying up loose ends, ensuring that no one remained who might threaten the secret he'd spent 60 years protecting. Frank believed that Shepard would eventually come for Luke, but not immediately. As long as Luke appeared to be nothing more than a failed handyman obsessed with rebuilding his father's cabin, he would be safe. But if he started asking the right questions or showed any sign of understanding Frank's true legacy, he would become a target. The letters provided one crucial piece of information that Frank's journal had lacked: Shepard's real identity. The coded references were subtle, but they painted a picture of someone with government connections, substantial financial resources, and the ability to arrange convenient accidents across multiple states over many decades. Frank's teammates had identified him as Clayton Morrison, a Korean War veteran who'd parlayed his military service into a successful career in defense contracting. Luke researched Morrison on his phone, fighting the weak cellular signal to piece together a public biography that seemed almost too perfect. Morrison had indeed served in Korea, rising to the rank of colonel before transitioning to civilian work with major defense contractors. He'd built a fortune in government contracts, maintained extensive political connections, and earned a reputation as a patriotic businessman who supported veterans' causes. The public face was exactly what someone would create to hide a lifetime of systematic murder. Morrison had the resources to arrange accidents, the connections to influence official investigations, and the perfect cover story to explain his interest in military history and veteran affairs. But Morrison was also in his 90s now, and even the most careful killer couldn't maintain operations indefinitely. Frank's letters suggested that the old man was training successors, passing his knowledge and responsibilities to younger operatives who would continue protecting the White Rock Creek secret after his death. Luke packed the letters carefully and secured them with the rest of Frank's evidence. The sun was setting, and he needed to make decisions about his next moves. He now knew who was responsible for his father's death and why. He knew where the treasure was hidden and how to reach it. Most importantly, he knew that he was living on borrowed time. Morrison and his organization had allowed Luke to play with his burned cabin because they didn't see him as a threat. But that protection would disappear the moment Luke showed any sign of understanding his father's secrets or pursuing the White Rock Creek treasure. The smart move would be to pack up his camping gear, drive back to town, and forget everything he'd learned. Luke could rebuild his handyman business, maintain his family relationships, and live the safe, modest life that everyone expected from him. But as Luke sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by evidence of his father's courage and sacrifice, he realized that safety had never been an option for the Raynor family. Frank had tried to protect his loved ones through distance and deception, but Morrison had killed him anyway. Luke could run, but there was no guarantee that Morrison wouldn't eventually decide that even a harmless failure like Luke Raynor posed too much risk to ignore. The only real safety lay in exposure. If Luke could find the treasure, document Morrison's crimes, and present evidence to the right authorities, he could eliminate the threat that had hung over his family for 60 years. It would be the most dangerous thing he'd ever attempted, but for the first time in his adult life, Luke Raynor had a chance to be the hero his father had always been in secret. Bobby Chen looked older than his 78 years when Luke finally tracked him down at a veterans assisted living facility in Missoula. The drive had taken Luke most of the morning, and he'd spent the entire journey rehearsing what he would say to Robert Chen's younger brother, the only surviving relative of Frank's teammate who might have answers about the coded letters. "I don't talk about Bobby's army service," the old man said before Luke had even finished introducing himself. "Told the family years ago that some things are better left buried." But something in Luke's face must have convinced him, because after a long pause, Bobby Chen invited Luke to his small apartment and made coffee with hands that shook only slightly from age rather than fear. "You found something, didn't you?" Bobby asked without preamble. Something Frank left behind that made you understand what really happened to our boys. Luke nodded and carefully extracted one of the coded letters from his jacket pocket. My father and your brother Robert stayed in touch for 30 years after Korea. They were documenting something, tracking people who died under suspicious circumstances. Bobby took the letter with reverence, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Robert always said Frank was the smartest of them. Said Frank would find a way to tell the truth eventually, even if it took decades. Bobby looked up at Luke with eyes that held 60 years of carefully guarded secrets. You sure you want to hear this story, son? Because once I tell it, you'll be carrying the same burden that killed your father and my brother. I'm already carrying it, Luke replied. I just want to understand what it means. Bobby poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and settled into his worn recliner. Your father never told you about the real mission, did he? About what they found in that mine shaft? Luke shook his head, though he'd pieced together most of the story from Frank's hidden documents. Nazi treasure, Bobby said simply, but not just gold bars and stolen jewelry. These were the crown jewels of the SS financial network, bearer bonds, rare gems, art pieces, things worth more than entire countries' annual budgets. The Germans had moved it all to Montana in the final months of the war, using sympathizers in the mining industry to hide it where no one would think to look. Bobby's voice took on the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this story in his mind countless times over the decades. Operation Shepherd was supposed to be a simple recovery mission. Find the treasure, secure it for the US government, and ensure it never fell into the wrong hands. Frank's team was perfect for the job, experienced soldiers who could handle themselves in rough country, smart enough to follow complex trails, and loyal enough to keep quiet about sensitive operations. But something went wrong, Luke said. Everything went wrong. Bobby's hands tightened around his coffee mug. The man they called Shepherd, Colonel Clayton Morrison, he wasn't working for the government, he was working for himself. The whole operation was a setup from the beginning. Morrison used military resources and personnel to conduct his own treasure hunt, then planned to eliminate the team once they'd done the hard work of finding and recovering the cash. Luke felt his stomach clench as Bobby confirmed what he'd suspected from the coded letters. Morrison killed them. Not directly, not at first. Morrison was too smart for that. He ordered the team to suspend operations and maintain surveillance only, claiming there were security concerns. But Frank and the boys figured out what was really happening. Morrison was waiting for the heat to die down, planning to come back later with his own people and claim the treasure for himself. Bobby stood up slowly and walked to a small desk in the corner of his apartment. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a digital recorder that looked decades newer than anything else in the room. Robert made this recording 3 days before he died, Bobby said. Mailed it to me with instructions to give it to Frank's family if anything happened to all of them. Took me 30 years to work up the courage to listen to it myself. Luke's pulse quickened as Bobby pressed play. His brother Robert's voice filled the small apartment, speaking with the measured tone of someone making a final confession. If you're hearing this, it means Morrison finally got to me. I've been expecting it for years, we all have. Frank thinks he's safe because he's made himself look like a worthless drunk. But Morrison's people have been watching all of us. They're patient, but they're thorough. The treasure is still at White Rock Creek, exactly where we left it in 1952. Morrison never recovered it because he needed us alive to do the actual work, and we never gave him the chance. The location is marked on Frank's survey maps. Bobby will know where to find them if something happens to Frank too. But here's what Morrison doesn't know. We documented everything. Every murder, every cover-up, every connection between Morrison's defense contracts and the money he's been using to silence witnesses. Frank has copies of everything, hidden where only his family will find them. The gold is worth maybe $200 million today. But Morrison's crimes are worth more than that. There's enough evidence to bring down his entire network of corrupt officials, crooked contractors, and hired killers. If someone finds this recording, they'll have the power to destroy a criminal organization that's been operating for 60 years. Robert's voice grew weaker, more urgent. Tell Frank's boy that his father was a hero. Every drink, every failed relationship, every moment that made him look weak, it was all to protect the people he loved. Frank Raynor sacrificed everything so that his family could live normal lives while he carried this burden alone. And tell Luke that if he chooses to finish what we started, he'll have the power to give his father the recognition Frank never got in life. The treasure is real, the evidence is solid, and Morrison is old enough that he can't run forever. Justice might be possible, but only if someone's brave enough to risk everything for it. The recording ended, leaving Luke and Bobby in silence. Luke stared at the small device, understanding that he'd just listened to a dead man's final gift to a family that had never known they needed it. "Morrison's still alive," Bobby said quietly. 94 years old and still running his organization from an estate outside of Helena. Robert always said Morrison would never stop, never retire, never trust anyone else with his secrets. The only way this ends is when Morrison dies or when someone makes him pay for what he's done. Luke thought about his family's dismissive attitude toward Frank's legacy, their certainty that he'd wasted his life in isolation and self-pity. They had no idea that Frank had been protecting them from a man who'd spent 60 years committing murder to hide his crimes. "Robert mentions evidence that Frank hid," Luke said. "Documents about Morrison's network." Bobby nodded toward Luke's jacket pocket, where the coded letters were carefully stored. "Those letters are just the beginning." Frank was documenting everything Morrison's business connections, the defense contracts he used to fund his operations, the network of people who helped him arrange accidents and cover up murders. If you've found Frank's hiding places, you've probably found evidence that could destroy Morrison's entire organization. Luke realized that his systematic search of the cabin's hidden compartments had been more productive than he'd understood. The documents he'd found weren't just treasure maps and war stories. They were the accumulated evidence of a decades-long criminal conspiracy. "But you have to understand," Bobby continued, "Morrison isn't just one old man anymore. He's built an organization that survives him. If you go after the treasure or try to expose his crimes, you'll be fighting people who have unlimited resources and 60 years of experience at making problems disappear." Luke stood up and shook Bobby's hand, understanding that this conversation had changed everything. He was no longer just a failed handyman trying to make sense of his father's secrets. He was the inheritor of a mission that had cost multiple lives and threatened everyone Frank had ever cared about. "Thank you for telling me the truth," Luke said. Bobby held his handshake for a long moment. Robert always said Frank's boy had more potential than anyone realized. "Said you got your father's stubbornness and your mother's heart. If anyone can finish what our boys started, it might be you." As Luke drove back toward the cabin, he carried more than just Bobby's confession. He carried the weight of understanding that his father's entire life had been shaped by one moment of discovery in a Montana mine shaft, and that Luke's life was about to be shaped by the same moment. The choice was no longer whether to search for the treasure. The choice was whether to let Frank Raynor's sacrifice mean something, or to let Morrison's organization continue killing people to protect secrets that should have been exposed decades ago. By the time Luke reached the cabin ruins, he'd made his decision. Luke found the business card tucked inside Frank's journal, so carefully placed that he'd missed it during his first readings. The card was expensive stock, cream-colored with raised lettering. Morrison Defense Solutions, Clayton Morrison, Chairman Emeritus. On the back, in Frank's careful handwriting, the shepherd, still watching after all these years. What made Luke's blood turn cold wasn't the confirmation of Morrison's identity. He'd already pieced that together from the coded letters. What terrified him was the date written beneath Frank's note, just 3 weeks before Frank's death. Morrison hadn't been a distant threat from Frank's past. He'd been an active, ongoing presence right up until the end. Luke's hands shook as he turned the card over again, studying the address printed below Morrison's name. Morrison Defense Solutions was located in Helena, less than 50 miles from Frank's cabin. For 30 years, while Luke and his family believed Frank was living in isolation, their father had been under surveillance by the man who'd killed his teammates. The implications hit Luke like physical blows. Morrison hadn't just known about Frank, he'd been close enough to monitor him personally, close enough to arrange the electrical fire that had destroyed the cabin, close enough to ensure that Frank's death looked natural while eliminating any evidence Frank might have left behind. Except Morrison hadn't found all the evidence. Frank had been too careful, too thorough in his preparations. The old soldier had spent decades hiding documentation in places so clever that even a professional like Morrison couldn't locate them all. Luke grabbed his laptop and searched for Morrison Defense Solutions, fighting the weak cellular signal to access the company's website. What he found looked like the perfect front for a criminal organization. Morrison's company specialized in historical research and asset recovery services for government agencies and private clients. The services they advertised, document analysis, site investigation, and discrete problem resolution, could easily describe treasure hunting and witness elimination. Most disturbing was the client list. Morrison Defense Solutions had contracts with the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and various intelligence agencies. Morrison hadn't just built a criminal organization, he'd embedded it within the legitimate government structure, using official contracts to fund and justify his operations. Luke scrolled through news articles and press releases, building a picture of Morrison's public persona. The man was a pillar of the Helena community, known for his generous donations to veterans organizations and his work preserving Korean War history. He'd received numerous awards for his service to the military community, including recognition from senators and congressmen who praised his dedication to honoring America's heroes. The perfect cover for someone who'd spent 60 years killing those same heroes to protect his stolen fortune. Luke found a recent photograph from a veterans' charity dinner. Morrison looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a distinguished elderly gentleman with white hair, expensive clothes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and deference. But Luke could see something else in Morrison's eyes, something that reminded him of the careful watchfulness he'd noticed in Frank's later photographs. This was a man who'd survived decades of criminal activity by never relaxing his guard, never trusting anyone completely, never leaving loose ends that could threaten his carefully constructed life. Luke realized that Morrison had probably attended Frank's funeral. The thought made him sick, imagining Morrison standing among the handful of mourners, offering condolences to Luke's mother while knowing that he'd murdered her ex-husband. Morrison would have been watching Luke that day, evaluating whether Frank's son posed any threat to secrets that were worth killing for. Luke had passed whatever test Morrison applied. A failed handyman with no apparent interest in his father's past, no military training, no resources for conducting complex investigations. Luke had looked like exactly the kind of harmless failure that Morrison could ignore safely. But Luke's decision to rebuild the cabin had changed the equation. Morrison's organization would have been monitoring the property, probably through automated surveillance systems that could detect unusual activity. They'd know that Luke was living on the site, that he was conducting systematic searches of the ruins, that he'd discovered at least some of Frank's hidden compartments. Luke checked his phone and saw that he had a voice message from an unknown number. The message was brief and courteous. "Mr. Raynor, this is Patricia Holmes from Morrison Defense Solutions. Mr. Morrison would like to meet with you to discuss your father's military service and some historical documents that might be of interest to our research department. Please call me at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting." Luke deleted the message immediately, understanding that Morrison's patience had finally run out. The old man knew that Luke had found something significant, and he was moving to contain the situation before it became uncontrollable. But Morrison's approach revealed something important about his current capabilities. Instead of arranging a convenient accident, Morrison was trying to handle Luke through official channels. That suggested either that Morrison was too old and careful to risk direct action, or that he was constrained by factors Luke didn't understand. Luke spent the rest of the day reviewing everything he'd learned about his father's secrets, looking for advantages he might have missed. Frank's documentation was thorough, but it focused on the past, proving what Morrison had done to Frank's teammates, not predicting what Morrison might do to Luke. The key was in Frank's final journal entry, the warning about, "If something happens to me." Frank had known that Morrison would eventually come for him, but he'd also prepared for the possibility that Luke might inherit both the treasure and the burden of exposing Morrison's crimes. Luke found Frank's contingency plan hidden in a compartment he'd missed during his initial searches. The plan was typically thorough, detailed instructions for contacting specific journalists, FBI agents, and congressional staffers who might be willing to investigate Morrison's organization. Frank had researched which officials weren't connected to Morrison's network, which media outlets had sufficient resources to protect sources, and which law enforcement agencies had the authority to investigate corruption in defense contracting. But Frank's plan also revealed the full scope of what Luke was facing. Morrison's organization included current and former government officials, military officers, defense contractors, and private security personnel. They had access to classified databases, surveillance equipment, and resources that made them essentially untouchable through normal legal channels. Frank's strategy had been based on overwhelming evidence rather than official protection. If Luke could recover the treasure, document Morrison's crimes, and simultaneously release the information to multiple independent outlets, the resulting scandal would be too big for Morrison's organization to contain or cover up. The plan was dangerous, but it was also Luke's only real chance for survival. Morrison had already decided that Luke knew too much to ignore. Running wouldn't help. Morrison's organization had tracked down and eliminated people across multiple states over many decades. Luke's only safety lay in making Morrison's secrets so public that killing him would create more problems than it solved. Luke packed Frank's evidence carefully, understanding that he was now carrying the accumulated proof of a criminal conspiracy that had operated for 60 years. The documents weren't just his father's legacy, they were Luke's weapon in a war that had started before he was born and would only end when either Morrison or Luke was dead. As he prepared for what he knew would be his final night at the cabin, Luke realized that Frank's greatest deception hadn't been pretending to be a worthless drunk. Frank's greatest deception had been raising a son who looked harmless enough that Morrison would underestimate him until it was too late to stop what Luke was about to unleash. Tomorrow, Luke would begin the journey to White Rock Creek and the Nazi treasure that had cost so many lives. But more importantly, he would begin the process of giving Frank Rayner the recognition he'd earned through 30 years of silent heroism. Morrison Defense Solutions was about to discover that they'd made a fatal mistake by allowing Luke Rayner to inherit his father's war. Luke found his father's final letter on the morning he planned to leave for White Rock Creek. It was hidden in the most obvious place imaginable, taped to the underside of Frank's favorite coffee mug, the one Luke had been using every morning since moving to the cabin. Frank had known that his son would eventually claim that small piece of familiarity from the ruins of his childhood home. The letter was written on the same heavy paper Frank had used for his journals, but the handwriting was different, looser, more personal, as if Frank had finally allowed himself to write as a father instead of a soldier documenting evidence. "Luke," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you found my secrets and chose to pursue them instead of walking away. I'm proud of you for that choice, and I'm sorry for what it's going to cost you. By now you know that I wasn't the failure I pretended to be. Every drink I took, every relationship I ruined, every moment I made you ashamed of me, it was all to protect you and your mother and your siblings from people who would have killed you just for being related to me. Morrison's organization doesn't leave loose ends, and family members are always loose ends. I know you probably hate me for the distance I kept between us. I wanted to teach you to hunt and fish, to show you how to read the mountains and live off the land, to pass on the skills that might have kept you alive if Morrison ever came for you. But teaching you those things would have revealed that I was more than I pretended to be, and that would have put you in danger. Instead, I had to watch you struggle with work that was beneath your abilities, listen to your family dismiss you as a failure, and know that I could never explain why keeping you safe was worth more to me than your respect or love. If you've gotten this far, you understand what Morrison is and what he's done. You know about the treasure at White Rock Creek and the people who died protecting it. Most importantly, you know that Morrison isn't just one old man. He's built an organization that will continue his work long after he's dead. I spent 30 years preparing for this moment, Luke. Not the moment of my death, but the moment when you would inherit everything I couldn't finish. I couldn't recover the treasure because doing so would have exposed you to Morrison's attention. I couldn't expose Morrison's crimes because I didn't have the resources to protect my family from retaliation. But you're different. You're not a frightened veteran trying to hide from his past. You're a skilled craftsman who understands how things work and how to fix them when they're broken. You're stubborn enough to finish what you start and smart enough to find solutions I never considered. Most importantly, you're angry enough at being underestimated to prove everyone wrong, including me. Here's what I couldn't teach you in person. Morrison's organization operates like a military unit, but they've grown comfortable and overconfident after 60 years of success. They expect to face confused civilians or isolated veterans, not someone who understands their methods and has prepared countermeasures. The treasure at White Rock Creek is exactly where my survey maps indicate. Morrison never recovered it because he needed my team alive to do the actual excavation work, and we never gave him the opportunity. The mine entrance is accessible if you know what you're looking for. The 1,945 cave-in was controlled and incomplete, designed to hide rather than permanently seal the main chamber. More importantly, I've documented every aspect of Morrison's operation: financial records, communication intercepts, evidence of murders spanning 6 decades. Everything you need to destroy his organization is hidden throughout this property. But the evidence is only useful if you can present it from a position of strength. That strength comes from the treasure itself. $200 million in Nazi gold gives you resources Morrison can't match and credibility Morrison can't discredit. More than that, it gives you the moral authority to speak for all the people Morrison has killed. You won't just be exposing a criminal organization, you'll be the agent of justice for victims who never got the chance to tell their stories. Morrison will try to stop you, but he's operating under constraints you can exploit. He can't risk exposure through direct action, and he can't trust his subordinates with the complete truth about what they're protecting. Use his paranoia against him. Force him to make mistakes by threatening the secrets he values more than the lives he's destroyed. I know I'm asking you to risk everything for something I couldn't accomplish myself. I know your family will think you're crazy for pursuing this, and I know you might die trying to finish what I started. But I also know that you're the only person who can end this, and that ending it is the only way our family will ever be truly safe. Morrison believes he's dealt with the last of the threats to his operation. Prove him wrong. Your father always, Frank Reno. P.S. Check the well. I left you some insurance. Luke read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it with the rest of Frank's documents. His father's words carried the weight of 30 years of preparation and sacrifice, but they also carried something Luke had never heard from Frank in life: absolute confidence in his son's abilities. Luke walked to the old well behind the cabin ruins, understanding that Frank's idea of insurance would be something practical and immediately useful. The well cover had been damaged in the fire, but the mechanism still worked. Luke lowered a flashlight on a rope, examining the walls as it descended. 20 feet down, he found what Frank had left for him: A waterproof container held military equipment that Frank had somehow acquired during his years of preparation, night vision goggles, radio equipment, and other gear that would give Luke tactical advantages. Morrison wouldn't expect a civilian to possess. But the most important item was a detailed topographical map of the area between the cabin and White Rock Creek, marked with surveillance positions, patrol routes, and defensive positions that Frank had identified during decades of careful observation. Morrison's people had been watching Frank, but Frank had been watching them too. Luke studied the map carefully, understanding that this was Frank's final gift, not just equipment, but knowledge. Frank had spent 30 years learning Morrison's methods, identifying his weaknesses, and preparing countermeasures that Luke could implement. The route to White Rock Creek wasn't just about reaching the treasure. It was about doing so without being detected, eliminated, or stopped by an organization that had 60 years of experience at preventing exactly this kind of expedition. Luke spent the afternoon preparing for his departure, following Frank's detailed instructions for equipment, supplies, and tactical considerations. But his preparations were interrupted by visitors who changed everything he thought he knew about the dangers he was facing. His family had come to stage an intervention. Helen, Tom, and Sarah arrived in 2 cars, clearly having coordinated their approach to present a united front. Luke watched them park near the cabin ruins, understanding that someone had called them with concerns about his mental state and increasingly erratic behavior. "We're worried about you," Helen said without preamble as Luke met them outside his tent. "You've been out here for 2 weeks, barely staying in contact, and now Tom says you're acting like Dad did in his final years." Luke realized that Morrison's organization hadn't needed to eliminate him directly. They'd simply made sure his family would do the job for them, removing Luke from the cabin before he could complete his search or begin his journey to the treasure. "I'm fine, Mum. Just working on the cabin and trying to understand Dad's life." Sarah stepped forward with the no-nonsense attitude that had made her successful in corporate environments. "Luke, this obsession with Dad's secrets isn't healthy. Whatever you think you found in these ruins, it's not worth destroying your life over." Tom was more direct. "We think you should come back to town, get some professional help, and let us handle selling the property. You're not thinking clearly, and we're not going to stand by and watch you turn into Dad." Luke wanted desperately to tell them the truth, to show them Frank's letter, to explain about Morrison's organization, to make them understand that everything they believed about their father was wrong. But Frank's warning echoed in his mind. The greatest protection was ignorance. As long as his family believed Luke was having a breakdown, they were safe from Morrison's attention. But if they learned about the treasure and the decades-long criminal conspiracy, they would become targets, just as Frank's teammates had been targets. Luke made the hardest decision of his life. He would let his family think he was mentally ill, rather than put them in danger by revealing the truth. "You're right," he said, injecting just enough uncertainty into his voice to sound convincing. "I think I've been obsessing over Dad's stuff. Maybe I do need some help." The relief on their faces was immediate and heartbreaking. They'd been genuinely worried about him, and his apparent willingness to accept help was exactly what they'd hoped to hear. "We can pack up your things and drive back to town tonight," Helen suggested. "I've already talked to Dr. Martinez about getting you an appointment." Luke nodded as if considering the offer, while actually calculating how to use their concern to his advantage. If his family believed he was abandoning his search and accepting help, Morrison would hear the same story through whatever surveillance network he was using to monitor the situation. "I just need one more night to pack everything properly," Luke said, "and I want to say goodbye to this place. Dad lived here for 30 years. I owe him that much respect." His family agreed to return the next morning, giving Luke exactly the window he needed. They would drive back to town, convinced that Luke was ready to give up his obsession with the cabin. Morrison would receive the same intelligence and would probably call off whatever immediate action he'd been planning. But Luke wouldn't be at the cabin when his family returned. He'd be beginning the journey to White Rock Creek, using their genuine concern as cover for the most dangerous mission he'd ever attempted. As he watched his family drive away, Luke understood that Frank's sacrifices had been even greater than he'd realized. Frank hadn't just given up his relationships to protect his family, he'd given up the possibility of ever being understood or appreciated by the people he loved most. Luke was about to make the same sacrifice. His family would think he'd run away from their help, confirming their worst fears about his mental state. They'd never know that he'd actually run toward the most important fight of his life. Frank's letter had been right about one thing. Luke was angry enough at being underestimated to prove everyone wrong. Tomorrow, he would begin proving that Frank Rayner's son was capable of finishing what his father had started, no matter what it cost him. Luke's radio crackled with Agent Wong's voice. "We have teams en route to your location. Do not engage with Morrison or his personnel. Continue documenting evidence and maintain communication with us." But Morrison had heard the same transmission. Luke watched through his scope as the old man's demeanor shifted from helpful citizen to military commander. Morrison began issuing rapid orders to his tactical team, repositioning them for what was clearly going to be a final assault on Luke's position. "Sir," one of Morrison's men said, his voice carrying through Luke's surveillance equipment, "FBI is en route. We need to abort and extract." Morrison's response was cold and decisive. 60 years of operational security doesn't end because some federal agents got curious. We finish this now, eliminate all witnesses, and clean up the scene before official response arrives. Luke realized, with sick certainty, that Morrison was planning to kill not just him, but his entire family. The old man couldn't allow any witnesses to survive who could connect Morrison Defense Solutions to the events at White Rock Creek. Luke keyed his radio for what he knew might be his final transmission. "Agent Wong, Morrison is ordering his people to eliminate all witnesses, including my family members. He's going to kill everyone here and stage it as a mining accident or equipment failure. You need to get here faster than he thinks you can." Morrison's tactical team was already moving. Luke could see them advancing up the slope toward his position, while others surrounded the mine entrance, where his family waited unknowingly. Professional soldiers with military-grade equipment, coordinating an operation they'd probably rehearsed dozens of times over the years. But Luke had advantages Morrison didn't expect. Frank's tactical training had covered asymmetric warfare, how to fight superior forces using terrain, preparation, and enemy overconfidence. Luke had spent hours studying Frank's annotations about the mine's layout, defensive positions, and escape routes. More importantly, Luke was fighting for something Morrison couldn't understand. Morrison was protecting stolen wealth and criminal secrets. Luke was protecting his family and his father's legacy. The difference in motivation mattered more than the difference in resources. Luke triggered the first of Frank's prepared surprises. His father had spent decades preparing for this confrontation, and part of that preparation had involved strategically placed charges designed to collapse specific sections of the mine while leaving escape routes intact. The controlled explosion sent Morrison's advance team scrambling for cover while creating a cloud of dust and debris that obscured Luke's movements. Luke used the confusion to move to a secondary position Frank had prepared, one that gave him clear sightlines to where Morrison was holding his family. Through his scope, Luke could see Morrison's rage at having his carefully planned operation disrupted by preparations he hadn't anticipated. The old man was discovering that Frank Rayner had been planning for this confrontation just as carefully as Morrison had been planning to prevent it. Luke's radio buzzed with multiple incoming transmissions. FBI teams were closer than Morrison had calculated, and they were coordinating with local law enforcement and emergency services for a major tactical response. News helicopters were already en route, having intercepted Luke's earlier broadcasts about Nazi treasure and government corruption. Morrison was running out of time to contain the situation, but he was also running out of options for escape. His organization had operated successfully for 60 years because they'd never faced exposure on this scale. A few dead treasure hunters could be covered up easily. A coordinated media and law enforcement response to a major Nazi treasure discovery involving defense contractor corruption was an entirely different problem. Luke watched Morrison make his final calculation. Instead of trying to eliminate all the witnesses and clean up the scene, Morrison decided to cut his losses and eliminate just the primary threat. Luke could see the old man directing his team to prepare for a final assault on Luke's position while leaving his family as potential hostages. But Morrison had made a crucial error. He'd assumed that Luke would prioritize his own survival over his family's safety, just as Morrison himself would have done. Morrison expected Luke to stay in defensive positions while his family remained at risk. Instead, Luke did exactly what Frank would have done. He abandoned his prepared positions and moved directly toward the greatest danger, using Morrison's tactical assumptions against him. Luke's approach caught Morrison's team completely off guard. They'd positioned themselves to assault a fixed defensive position, not to deal with a mobile threat who was willing to sacrifice tactical advantage for strategic initiative. Using the mining equipment the Germans had left behind, Luke created additional chaos and confusion. 60-year-old demolition charges still worked if you knew how to trigger them properly. Frank's documentation had included detailed notes about German engineering, including the explosive charges they'd used to modify the original mine structure. The secondary explosions forced Morrison's team into retreat positions while giving Luke the opportunity he needed to reach his family. But Morrison himself was waiting with a pistol aimed directly at Helen's head. "Frank's boy," Morrison said with grudging respect as Luke emerged from the smoke and debris. "You're more like your father than I expected, but you're also going to die like your father, protecting a family that never understood what you sacrificed for them." Luke could see Morrison's tactical situation clearly. The old man was trapped between Luke's position and the approaching FBI response, with no remaining options for escape or concealment. Morrison's organization was finished, his secrets were exposed, and his only remaining goal was to eliminate the people who destroyed his life's work. "My family doesn't need to die for this," Luke said, keeping his voice steady while calculating distances and angles. "Your fight is with me. Let them walk away." Morrison laughed bitterly. "Your family stopped being innocent the moment you decided to dig up secrets that were supposed to stay buried." Frank understood that. He kept his distance to protect them. You brought them right into the line of fire. Luke realized that Morrison was right about the tactical situation, but wrong about the strategic one. Luke had brought his family into danger, but he'd also brought Morrison into the open, where the old man could finally be held accountable for 60 years of murder and corruption. The sound of helicopters filled the valley as FBI tactical teams and news crews converged on White Rock Creek simultaneously. Morrison's window for eliminating witnesses was closing rapidly, forcing him into the kind of hasty, exposed action that had gotten so many of his victims killed over the decades. Luke took the shot his father had trained him for without ever explaining why. The golden Nazi medallion Luke had recovered from the treasure cache flew from his hand in a perfect arc that struck Morrison's weapon just as the old man fired. Morrison's shot went wide, giving Luke's family the opportunity to dive for cover while Luke closed the distance between himself and the man who'd destroyed Frank Rayner's life. The fight that followed was brief but decisive. Morrison was 94 years old and had been relying on younger operatives for physical confrontations for decades. Luke was 43 years old, in excellent physical condition from construction work, and motivated by 30 years of suppressed anger at his family's treatment. When FBI agents finally reached the scene, they found Clayton Morrison unconscious and zip-tied with materials Luke had improvised from mining equipment. Luke was sitting beside the treasure cache, surrounded by documentation that would expose the largest criminal conspiracy in American military history. Luke's family was safe, Morrison's organization was finished, and Frank Rayner's secrets were finally ready to see the light of day. 6 months after White Rock Creek, Luke stood in the rebuilt cabin that had started everything, holding Frank's Purple Heart medal and watching his nephew Tommy learn to use his grandfather's tools. The media storm had finally died down, the FBI investigation was nearing completion, and the Rayner family was learning to live with a completely different understanding of who Frank had been. Clayton Morrison was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, his defense contractor empire dismantled, and its assets frozen pending restitution to victims' families. The Nazi treasure had been turned over to international authorities for distribution to Holocaust survivors and their descendants, exactly as Frank would have wanted. Luke had received a substantial finder's fee, enough to rebuild the cabin properly and establish the foundation he'd been planning. But the real treasure hadn't been the gold bars and precious stones Luke had found in the mineshaft. The real treasure had been learning that Frank Rayner was a hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect the people he loved most. "Grandpa Frank was really a soldier?" Tommy asked, studying the Purple Heart medal with the serious attention only 8-year-olds could bring to important questions. "He was more than a soldier," Luke replied, kneeling down to his nephew's eye level. "He was someone who did what was right, even when it cost him everything, even when the people he was protecting didn't understand why he was doing it." Helen had aged years in the months since White Rock Creek, processing the knowledge that her ex-husband had spent 30 years appearing to be a failure while actually being the most successful person she'd ever known. The guilt of not understanding Frank's sacrifices was something she carried heavily, but she was learning to balance that guilt against pride in what he'd accomplished. "I wish I could apologize to him," she'd told Luke during one of their long conversations about Frank's real legacy. "I wish I could tell him that I understand now why he kept his distance." Tom and Sarah had undergone their own transformations. Tom's insurance business was thriving, partly because of the attention his family had received during the Morrison trials, but mostly because he'd learned to appreciate the kind of quiet persistence that Frank and Luke had both demonstrated. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her corporate job to help Luke establish the Frank Rayner Foundation, using her organizational skills to create something that would honor their father's memory properly. The foundation's mission was simple: providing support for military veterans who'd been involved in classified operations, helping them reintegrate into civilian life without having to carry dangerous secrets alone. Frank would have appreciated the irony his life's work of protecting secrets was being used to help other veterans escape the burden of similar secrets. Luke had used part of his finder's fee to purchase additional land surrounding the original cabin, creating a retreat center where veterans could find the kind of peace Frank had sought in isolation. The difference was that Luke's veterans wouldn't have to face their challenges alone. The rebuilt cabin looked nothing like Frank's original structure, but it carried the same sense of solid permanence that Frank had built into everything he touched. Luke had used traditional construction methods, quality materials, and careful attention to detail, the kind of craftsmanship that would last for generations. More importantly, the cabin was filled with family again. Luke's brothers and sister visited regularly, often bringing their children to learn about their grandfather's real story. The isolation that had protected Frank's secrets was no longer necessary, and the Rayner family was finally able to gather in the place that had defined so much of their history. Luke walked to the window that looked out toward the mountains, where White Rock Creek carried its secrets toward the valley. The mine had been permanently sealed by federal authorities, but the truth of what had happened there would never be buried again. Frank's documentation had provided evidence for prosecutions that would continue for years, dismantling networks of corruption that had operated for decades. The phone rang with a call Luke had been expecting. Agent Patricia Wong had become a regular contact during the investigation, and her calls usually meant that Morrison's organization had revealed another layer of criminal activity that required Luke's expertise to understand. "We found another cache," Agent Wong said without preamble. Morrison's people were maintaining operational funds in locations across 6 states. Your father's documentation helped us find accounts that go back to the 1960s. Luke smiled at the thought of Frank's meticulous record-keeping continuing to pay dividends for justice decades after his death. How much this time? 40 million in various accounts and safe deposit boxes, all of it traceable to defense contracts that Morrison used to fund his operations. We're adding it to the restitution fund for victims' families. Luke made notes about the discovery, adding it to the growing list of Morrison's crimes that Frank had documented over 30 years of careful investigation. Every revelation proved that Frank's sacrifice had been even greater than Luke had realized. His father had been fighting a criminal organization whose scope and resources were almost unimaginable. After ending the call, Luke returned to the workshop where Tommy was learning to use Frank's hand plane to smooth a piece of oak. The boy had his grandfather's patience and attention to detail, plus his uncle's stubbornness about getting things right. "Uncle Luke," Tommy said, concentrating on his work, "Mom says Grandpa Frank was sad a lot because he couldn't tell people what he was really doing." Luke considered how to explain complex concepts about sacrifice and protection to an 8-year-old. Sometimes doing the right thing means other people don't understand why you're doing it. Grandpa Frank knew that keeping his secrets would make people think he was a failure, but he also knew that telling his secrets would put his family in danger. Tommy nodded seriously, processing this information with the same methodical approach he applied to woodworking. So he picked protecting his family over looking good? Exactly. And that's what heroes do. They care more about protecting other people than about what other people think of them. Luke realized that Tommy would grow up with a completely different understanding of what strength looked like than Luke had possessed at the same age. Tommy would know that sometimes the strongest people were the ones who looked weakest to casual observers. He would understand that real courage often meant accepting misunderstanding and criticism rather than seeking recognition and praise. As evening approached, Luke prepared dinner for the family members who would be arriving soon. The rebuilt cabin's kitchen was large enough to accommodate the gatherings that Frank had never been able to host, and Luke took quiet satisfaction in using the space for the kind of family meals his father had always wanted but could never risk. Sarah arrived first, carrying files related to the Foundation's work and updates on the media requests that still came in regularly. The Raynor family story had captured public attention not just because of the Nazi treasure and government corruption, but because of the deeper themes about sacrifice, family, and the different ways people could be strong. Tom arrived with his wife and children, followed by Helen with the photo albums she'd been organizing as part of the Foundation's historical documentation project. The evening would combine business with family time, just as Frank would have appreciated if he'd been able to see his children working together on something meaningful. Over dinner, they discussed the Foundation's latest projects and the ongoing FBI investigation, but the conversation inevitably returned to Frank and the new understanding they were all still processing. "I keep thinking about all the times I criticized him for not taking better care of himself," Helen said, looking at the Purple Heart medal Luke had placed on the mantel. "All those years I thought he was giving up on life when he was actually giving up everything else to preserve life, our lives." Luke raised his glass of Frank's favorite whiskey, the good bottle that had been saved for special occasions that never came during Frank's lifetime. "To Frank, Raynor, who taught us that the greatest love sometimes looks like distance, and that the strongest people are often the ones nobody notices." The family drank the toast in silence, each of them carrying their own memories of Frank and their own understanding of what his sacrifices had meant. Later, after his family had gone home and Luke was alone in the cabin Frank had built and Luke had rebuilt, he sat on the porch and looked out at the Montana landscape that had witnessed so much hidden history. Frank's secrets were finally exposed, Morrison's organization was destroyed, and the Raynor family legacy was secure. But Luke knew that Frank's most important lesson wasn't about treasure or criminals or government conspiracies. Frank's most important lesson was that love, sometimes required sacrifice, that protecting people sometimes meant accepting their misunderstanding, and that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge that someone had cared enough to give up everything for your safety. Luke pulled out his phone and made one final call of the day to a veteran in Colorado who'd reached out to the foundation for help with his own classified service issues. Like Frank, the veteran was carrying secrets that isolated him from his family and community. Unlike Frank, this veteran wouldn't have to carry those secrets alone. The Frank Rayner Foundation would make sure of that.